Thanks for joining us for another edition of Lead.exe. I'm Brian Comerford in Denver, Colorado.
And I'm Nick Lozano in Washington, D.C.
And today we're talking a little bit about creating online identity, and particularly around the idea of creating your own personal brand.
Yeah, and I figured, this is actually your idea. I got to give you credit for that. And you had some thoughts behind it. So why don't you just explain why here we are, a technology leadership podcast. Why are we talking about online personal branding?
Yeah. So, part of it came out of just as I've been reflecting really on some of the characteristics that seem like they've had almost a compounding effect coming through the pandemic. I looked a lot at what has happened with just widespread utilization of platforms like LinkedIn in the 14 or so months that we've been going through progressive states of lockdown and remote workforce. So I started thinking of it in terms of what was a multiplying force more recently in sort of the wave prior to that. I thought about how really the development of .com in the 1990s, it took some time for that user adoption to fall into place. It took the better part of a decade, right? And that by the time kind of the mainstream at large was dialed into what all of that meant, those of us that had been part of that first wave of .com, we were already moving on to other facets of, digitization. But, for most people, it was sort of the advent of the smartphone that really started creating the ubiquity of what a lot of folks have characterized as Web 2.0, or that more social media context, where if Web 1.0 was you went to the web, for retrieving information or going to more of a static brochure site, Web 2.0 became that interactive capability where now you're posting, you're interacting. There are things that are more personalized about your interactivity with web assets versus just having informational access to things. And so as I kind of thought ahead into what in this last decade has had that same kind of multiplying force, I thought about really this year of pandemic, where a lot of people who are already digital workers to some degree have been forced to relocate to remote office working and have become more and more dependent on digital technologies. And all of a sudden, this concept of, centralizing brand identity around yourself as either a professional or your business has become, there's been more of a confluence around it, I think in part because folks have been forced into working with digital tools more than ever before. So I'm just kind of curious if you share that perception, or if, am I just pie in the sky and how I'm thinking about this?
I think, it kind of has something to do with, yes, they're millennials and, Gen Zs and whatever, Gen Xs have had more access to technology, right? Because it was there, right? As we were younger. I'm on the tail edge of millennial, the beginning edge, and the tail edge of Generation X. So I don't really necessarily, from a generation perspective, identify with millennials. I'm somewhere kind of in between. But, it always reminds me back to this great quote. It's like the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed, by William Gibson, right? So the technology has always been there. From an internet perspective, we think of the early days of internet, IIRC, forums, right? The tech nerds were the first ones to get out there and do that because you had to have the know-how to actually connect up a modem, right?
BBS, baby.
Yeah, and you had to set your baud rate and everything. You had to know how to do that stuff, and your everyday home user, obviously they couldn't get on the internet to access that information. You had to kind of know how to do it because information wasn't as easily readily available. But once you were on the web, even in the early days, there was tons of information, tons of networking opportunities. And like you said, I think the past year has been a great thing for people to realize that I've been pretty active on LinkedIn for probably like 2.5 years, ever since we started this podcast. And I've seen a growing number of professionals just in general
Hmm.
start posting on there or start interacting on there. It's been like a huge wave of people, mainly salespeople initially in the beginning, because they're like, okay, well,
Sure.
I need to make sales. So how do I reach out and find new clients when I'm not flying to one of my current clients and then hitting prospects in the city? So it's definitely been there for a while. I think it's just not as evenly distributed. And back to your point about a personal branding, I think it's important, right? As a leader or just anybody in general, right? If you're trying to sell something or you're trying to get a job or you want somebody to look at something, isn't it easier to sell something or get somebody to look at something when they have somewhat of an idea of who you are already, right? it's that idea of, giving people things and giving them things and never asking anything in return, knowing one day
Yeah.
that all those things that you give will pay back in the end. And it's the same, just like with leadership, right? You're judged on the amount you give, not the amount you take, right? Nobody wants to interact with somebody else like on LinkedIn or any social platform who's just like, hey, look at this. Hey, you want to buy this? Hey, you want to buy this? You become that annoying person who goes door to door trying to sell everything, right? Which there's nothing wrong with that, but that's the feeling that people get when it's just like all this loud, like, hey, buy this, buy this, buy this, check me out. So to your point, I think, the past year has really driven some people to look at themselves and their presence outside of just being identified with a company, if that makes sense. And maybe
Yeah.
I answered your question, but I didn't answer your question.
No, you touched on a lot of
Okay.
things that I think are worth exploring. And, one of them that you just referenced without actually referencing the term that I've heard become associated with it is social selling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I had never heard that term probably until, the last 12 months or so, although that's, it's been around already for half a dozen years. And really, it has a lot to do with what you and I have talked about as a leadership principle. I mean, you just said it. It's almost like your credibility, your authenticity is based off of the measure of how much you give versus how much you take. Right? How much are you extending a hand versus looking for a handout?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And yet, there's been this whole philosophy that's kind of developed, as you mentioned, that sort of led with the salespeople, where social selling has now become this buzz. And
Yeah.
and really, it's when you break it down, it's just about facets of authenticity. It's how do you create a brand and an identity for yourself that's less about what product you're peddling versus how are you trying to create an online presence that has value to others, so that then they do in fact want to engage with you, like you who you are, not not you because you represent the sales engine of some company, right?
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's about being authentic, right? And letting people know who you are. It's easier for, like, if we're talking about from the selling perspective, which I know our most of our audience probably aren't in sales unless they're in technical sales of some kind,
Sure.
which is fine. But it's like people want to do business and interact with people. They want to don't interact with companies, right? We buy things from other people. Uh, and when it comes to just like if you think of LinkedIn, it's networking, right? I'm more prone to do business with somebody I've networked, have conversations with before, who hasn't tried to sell me anything in the past, just because we've built a
Yeah.
relationship, right? And salespeople, to a degree, would always do this, right? When they could travel,
Mm.
they'd hit some office that maybe there's a prospective client on the same floor in the building or another floor down. They just pop in, say, hey, can I buy you a drink or whatever? And they just have a social interaction to get to know them. But that's the type of thing you can do digitally now. And like you said, over the past year, it's, people identify with other people, right? When you think of Virgin itself, right, you don't think of Virgin the company, you think of Richard Branson, right? And you think of his own personal brand, and then you just think of the Virgin brand underneath him, right? Because he is that brand. He built that. He's much more interesting as an individual than he is as Richard Branson, the CEO of Virgin, whatever he's doing now, right? And that's the same thing. Even if you're just a lowly tier one support person, you do have value to give. You have stuff to give people, right? You have something to say, and some information to share. And that's the one thing I feel like that holds people back from going to do that personal branding, because they get on somewhere like LinkedIn and they look at somebody who gets like millions upon millions of views, right, on some piece of content. But that doesn't matter. Like, one thing that a lot of people don't realize is a lot of social media can be faked. Like, a lot of those numbers can be faked. They'll join these things called engagement groups, and people will pitch in together to try and drive numbers up.
Right.
But in reality, numbers are just numbers. They don't really mean anything, right? It's without any context behind them. So I would say don't let that discourage you from getting out somewhere and just sharing information. Like, so maybe you're tier one, maybe you know how to tell people how to do emojis from their keyboard, right? Windows key and period. We'll pull up the emoji thing. And you'll find tons of people who don't even know how to do that, who will probably think it's the coolest thing and start following you and interacting with you.
Yeah, well said. And, I think, in fact, rather than discouraging you, it should encourage you, right? If you've got no numbers, if you've got 2 followers, right, create something that is content that's worthwhile engaging with, and see what happens with that. And it's a two-way street, right? You've got to go out and engage with others as well. You've got to really find those who are creating some of the compelling content and make connections with them. And if you're in an environment like LinkedIn, you should like those things, but don't just like them, go the extra step and make a comment. If there's something that you feel like the content made you respond in a certain way, make sure you leave a comment. And based on my understanding of the way LinkedIn's algorithms work, that's part of what starts helping to elevate your own profile in terms of engagement, because you're not just out there cranking through profiles and clicking like on whatever the latest post is. You're actually showing that there's a degree of engagement. You've thought about the content that's being presented and you're interacting with it in some way.
Yeah, and I mean, you don't have to spend a ton of time, right? You don't have to spend hours and hours a day on it. Like you said, comments are content, right? And if you leave a comment on like a Gary Vaynerchuk post who gets thousands upon thousands of views a day, you can be seen a lot if it's a great comment, right? It'll push your comment up to the top, and you'll be seen more than if you post your own content initially in the beginning. But like you said, looking at those numbers of what you would post, because what'll happen in social media is a lot of people will post for a week and they're like, oh, nobody's looking at my stuff. Well, the first time you do anything, is it great? Like, it's like all my beginning content's so horrible. And it's only through trial and error and engaging with other people that people actually started to listen to what I was saying. Because in the beginning, no one was listening to anything I said, right? I had no idea what I was doing. I just copying what other people were doing on LinkedIn, sharing a viral piece of media and going, oh, why is nobody interacting? No, it's because like the people who are there all the time see that stuff and they don't want to interact with that, because it's like, well, if I could see it somewhere else, why do I care that it's here? But comparing yourself to others is a dangerous game in any shape or form, right? And you know that even from a leadership perspective, right? Everybody's on their own path and their own journey. And you should only compare yourself to who you were yesterday. Are you better than you were yesterday? Then that's all that matters.
Beautiful. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up too, because one of the things that I thought would be worth talking about, we've got, I think, some specifics that we can get into, particularly around some of what you've shared in terms of, how you develop something like a podcast. You actually published your own ebook that you shared out through your own personal channel. But part of what that started also connecting to me in terms of, from a leadership perspective, Andy Grove, talked about, why wait for a board to oust you if that's really part of your concern, right, as a leader, because it's a real potential at a lot of different organizations. Why take the time to fret over how that might come to pass? Why not reverse that and think in terms of what are the things that wouldn't be satisfying to a board, And what are some of those things that could start shaping a path for your ouster, and then actually go and take the time to really put some thought into considering, well, why not take some of those things and put them into practice now, even if it's just putting it into a strategy, into a game plan. And so one of the comments that again, I think I referenced this book by Eric Qualman that even though it's 10 to 12 years old now, it's still chock full of relevant goodness for today. One of the things that he talks about in chapter 14 of that book is called Recreate Yourself, right? And so kind of the basis of that is talking about what's the void you would leave behind if suddenly you yanked something like your LinkedIn profile, right? And so I think about what you just described, Nick, and the Nick Lozano profile of whatever it is 18 months ago. If you suddenly took down all the content that was there,
no one would notice.
It might not have barely be a blip probably for most people, even those who were routinely interacting with you, who are connected to you. But now that you've been out there and you've created a lot of content, you've developed a lot of relationships with people that you've actually never physically met, right?
Yeah.
Who are very active in being interactive with your content. If you pulled your profile down today, there would be a void. I mean, there would be people who are looking for the things that you're posting next, or whatever your next campaign is. So I'd kind of like to get your thoughts on some of that as well, and kind of shift the conversation a little bit more into brand identity.
Yeah, I would think. The key is to just start, right? Just start trying to do something. Because like you said, if my LinkedIn profile from 18 months ago, how many members does LinkedIn have? Like 10 million or something. Like, I don't even know how many profiles are on there, right? And if you were just to, search me on job title there, how many other people are going to come up in there, right? Like, it's just like, how many in a list of search results am I going to be? Who knows? And part of my foray into social media really was to promote this podcast, right? Because it's difficult to promote something when people don't know what it is. And I'll go, the one thing I always say with podcasting, right? The hardest part of it is the promotion. The easiest part is hopping on here, recording it, guest, editing. The hardest thing you'll ever find with it is the promotion. And that's where the personal branding comes in, right? It's easier for me to create content and give stuff to share from a personal level. That's not even the podcast stuff, right? And then it gets people generally interested in who you are as a person. And then they start digging a little bit deeper, right? I have the Lead.exe podcast as a job on there, and people just find it organically. Like you said the other day, you're like, oh, I looked at the Lead.exe podcast thing and it had X number of followers. I had even no idea I had that many people following it. But that's just me doing passive engagement, right? Not asking anybody to like my stuff or to like the podcast. I'm like, when I bring it up most of the time, I'm like, hey, I do this, and it's there, but I'm not requiring people to. I'm just asking, like, hey, if you think my conversations is interesting, we want to check out the other information that we have. And get back to your point, it's like, just start, right? Don't be worried too much about the things that can go wrong. What will my coworkers think if they see it? For the most part, I've found even with my business relationships, people really enjoy my content, or they have told me they've enjoyed it, and they have had interacted absolutely zero on it. So people do passively consume. I did have somebody tell me one time, he's like, oh, I really love all your content on LinkedIn. And I didn't even know he was active on LinkedIn because I've never seen him on there. He's never liked any of my information. He's never liked any of my posts. But that's the power of personal branding. There's tons of people out there just passively consuming, right? They get on LinkedIn and they scroll through the feed. The average LinkedIn user spends 17 minutes a month on there or something like that. So that means maybe a couple of minutes a week, outside of people who are in sales who probably spend a majority of their time on there. But it's get out there, start building a personal brand just for yourself, right? I'm not a huge fan of the personal branding thing, right? Because it always makes people feel like you're selling something, right? we got to do this personal branding because you got to sell. Well, from a leadership perspective, it's good to get your ideas out there, right? Just let people know who you are and your thoughts and ideas from a leadership perspective. You don't have to have anything to sell to start building a reputation or a presence. And you will be surprised that if you start sharing this information, you'll find people who are interested, and then people who want to be on, who will want you to come on their podcast and be interviewed with them about the subjects that you enjoy talking about. So don't let the terms social selling and personal branding get in the way of thinking like that's a sales thing, right? That's completely sales. I don't need to do that. The whole thing is, you think about it this way. If you're sharing those ideas, those thoughts and information, you might get career opportunities that come out of the woodworks because people are passively consuming that. It's much easier to find another job or anything when people already know who you are, right? If you have a tailored out LinkedIn profile, tons of engagement, recruiters are going to see that information because they're on there all day long. It's just the nature of exposure, right? So don't let the terms branding and selling get in your way. Just pick one thing and start.
Yeah, I'm with you, 100% agreement. When I think of personal branding, I think of it in terms of, again, what we were referring to with authenticity, right? It's just taking the time to really extend the thought leadership that you're experiencing on a day-to-day basis with either your colleagues or in your work environment, those things that you're thinking about, those things that are critical. If they're critical for your business or if they're critical for your role, it's likely that there are many other people that it will be critical for as well. And if you take the time to really extend what's happening in your own personal experience and you create content around it, and then you help try to socialize that content, that's, to me, really the crux of personal branding. It's just being authentic in that which you do.
Yep. Just be you. And the thing I'll say too is, and you say creating content, right? And people always get this like, oh, well, I don't know what to write about, right? There's already Gary Vaynerchuk. Like if anybody here is in social media or has been on social media, you've probably seen Gary Vaynerchuk, the really loud New York accent guy. Like, you've seen him.
Gary V.
Gary V, yeah. And if you haven't seen him, just Google him real quick and you've probably seen him somewhere. But it's one of those things, just don't worry about in the beginning what you're going to post about. Just post something. Throw stuff at the wall and just see what sticks and what feels good with you, right? You don't have to drive value every single time, right? Sometimes making people laugh is giving people value, right? Because you're giving them entertainment. Like a couple weeks ago, and I still do this now, is I put absolutely ridiculous quotes on my headshot. Right? It's just like absolutely, and people enjoy it. And it's just one of those things like, well, I'm not giving hardcore business value, but I'm giving people entertainment, right? And that just shows a side of my personality, is that, I like to joke around. I'm not serious all the time. I mean, I love talking about leadership. I love talking about technology, but I can't do that 24/7, just like I'm sure you can't, right? Sure. So just try a bunch of things and see what you enjoy talking about, and leave some comments on stuff. You might find that over time, just leaving comments, you might find a way to build your own personal identity of how you want to share on any social platform. And the key to it is just to be yourself, right? If you're not interested in, thought leadership, and that's the top topic on Twitter that's trending, don't try to fit a, square peg in a round hole. It's like, it's not going to work long term. It might work short term, but you're not going to be able to keep that up because you're not interested in it, right?
Yeah, it's true. I got a message from someone who's a follower of mine in my network. They asked a question. They said, this is really something that they're trying to do. How do I start to engage? I've got a whole bunch of followers, but I don't even know. Kind of to what you're saying, Nick. What would I post about? I'm not a writer. I don't feel like I think deeply about things in a way that other people are going to want to engage with it. And I just said, what's the last article that you read that was interesting to you? And they started, they went through this whole diatribe of like all of these things that I thought were completely fascinating. And I said, well, there you go. I mean, how easy is it to grab a link from something that's been published online through either an industry trade publication or, one of your favorite news sites, or, any of these, various forums for content, resharing that content on your own feed and making some kind of personal comment about why it was important to you. It may be the timeliness of the situation, in terms of COVID pandemic, or, tornadoes in Alabama, or, whatever the content is. But just taking the time to share a link to something that might be of value to others, who, they may actually gain some insights just by you taking the time to even say, hey, I just read this. It helped me think about something a little bit differently that's been on my mind. That can be the entire length of the post, followed by the link. It doesn't have to be, a 60-minute podcast. It doesn't have to be a lengthy, blog post. It can just be something as simple as a link with a comment.
Yeah, and I will say, like, when it comes to, there's different forms of content, right? If you're a writer, then write, right? Try writing. If you're not a writer and it doesn't come naturally to you, then maybe don't start with that, right? Whatever medium that speaks to you, then start there, right? Are you good with audio? Well, then maybe start some SoundCloud thing and share sound bites or something. Are you good at taking pictures? Well, then maybe do something on Instagram or something to start, putting your motivational quotes or something. I mean, there's tons of ways. It's just like when you do art, right? You just got to find the medium that speaks to you, that you can do relatively quickly, and you enjoy doing it, right? Because at the end of the day, if you don't enjoy the process, or you don't enjoy what you're talking about, how are you going to stick with it? It's the same thing when we talk about fitness, right? I always compare this to fitness, because everybody wants, the 6-pack abs, and, like, it wants to look great for the beach, right? And we all know how to get there, right? Everybody. You can ask anybody, they know how to do it, right? But how many people stick with it, right? Because there needs to be an overarching driving purpose more than just, I want to look fit, right? For those people, there has to be more behind that when you're sharing content, right? Are you just sharing about leadership because you enjoy talking about leadership? Because in the beginning, when you post about that stuff, you're probably going to have nobody interacting with it, right? That's just the nature of the beast, right? Until you start interacting with other people, you're not going to get people interacting with your stuff. So you definitely want to start doing stuff that interests you in the beginning, and share things that will keep you going.
Yeah, amen to that. And again, I think that factors directly into the authenticity of what it is that you're trying to share. And I'd like to get into the mechanics of doing some of that a little bit. But first, I would just, I want to go down one more rabbit trail, which is, really tied to a comment that you made early in the program related to, this is a topic that may sound a lot more salesy and less relevant to someone who is on the technology side of things. But I think in terms of, a couple different factors. Number one, if you're in technology and you have a sales component of your organization, at some point you're going to be charged with having some thought leadership around what can you do to help enable those people who are coming to you with some of these questions, right? And as a leader in technology in particular, if you're able to step out into the forefront and help lead with some of the knowledge that you have, whether it's with how features work within a CRM system, whether it's, what you've seen that's effective in terms of setting a sales strategy as you're engaging with something like a technology platform, marketing automation, that sort of thing. Those are the things that, again, that helps elevate the role that you're in from a thought leadership perspective. And those things could additionally translate into, this is great content that's worthwhile sharing in a broader context. Similarly, leaders throughout organizations, whether they are the head of sales, whether they're the head of technology, the head of marketing, whatever it is, right? More and more, they are being tasked with being the thought leaders around some kind of strategy that does involve technical components related to it, and oftentimes sharing of data. And so starting to think through, what are all these different ways that we can use this to really help leverage some kind of social media campaign or, some kind of digital presence online. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that because it's,
Yeah.
it does have relevance, to a lot of different domains.
I would add on to that no matter where you are at in your career, you should probably have some type of professional social presence, right? Whether that's LinkedIn or a personal website or Twitter or whatever of these, number of platforms there are, you should probably have something, right? It's definitely easier for, I would say it, let's just say, because most people work at a job, right? They work at a job, and then when they want to get a new job, they start applying for jobs. Well, isn't it easier if people already kind of know who you are and you start building this networking, this communication channels with people ahead of time, so that eventually when time comes, you're looking for a job, people know who you are. They can easily see what your thoughts and ideas are. And they bring you in for an interview. They're looking at your LinkedIn profile. They can see what kind of content you post. They see what you're passionate about. It's just not bringing you in for a blank interview. That's just my 2 cents on that. You should at least start thinking about sharing something of some form, maybe thoughts and ideas. That's just my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned earlier was, if you're a tier one technician, and you're trying to think of, how can I elevate myself to that next level? Creating some of this content would be a great way to do it. And even if you were to just stop and think about what are the 10 most common user support requests that come in, right? Some of them may be very specific to your industry, but I'll bet the majority of them are not. I'll bet the majority of them are ubiquitous regardless of industry type. And so trying to frame some of your own knowledge around, hey, what can I do to help support others, right? This is, how many times do you go to Google or YouTube just to try to track down a quick how-to video, right? And you find these things that are, 15 seconds, 30 seconds long on some kind of configuration step that's been eluding you or something. And someone took the time to actually put that together, put it in their channel.
And, they saved you hours. They saved you hours and they didn't even know it, right?
That's right. I as a practice, I always do my best to like those posts that have been helpful to me in that way, or drop a comment in there, and it might not be so much that I feel like, I've got to subscribe to this person's channel. But again, by being someone who's giving that information freely and you just took the time to do it, it's not like there has to be, a whole lot of production that goes into something like that. But there are, plenty of tools out there that are freebies that allow you to do something like a video recording of a screen share where you can just walk through a couple of steps. You can even have an in-screen, view of yourself talking if, you're open to doing something like that, or have an informational text box that provides more information that listeners, can follow on to. But those are the types of things that, again, I think start creating a personal brand identity that they're truly about you, right? It's truly about, these are the things that I'm engaged in. I've got some expertise in this area. I like to be helpful in this way. All of those things are great for being both career builders as well as just helping to expand your network with people who are interested and engaged in what you're doing.
Yeah. I think you bring up a great point. Look at it as not social selling, but as network building, right? Because these interactions you have with people, develop relationships. I've met some really cool people online that I've never met in person that I would consider friends, right? And it's one of those things, if I ever, for some reason, decided to get out of technology and pivot, I instantly have a network of people that I could reach out to and people that know me regardless of what industry I'm in. And so I to add on to your point, think of it as networking, right? If social selling scares you, you have nothing to sell, just think of it like, hey, this is networking. Same thing if I went to a conference and it's the cocktail hour or
That's right.
whatever they do and everyone goes around, just talk to people. Don't be the person who hands out the business card and it's like, hey, what can I do for you? This is what I sell. Don't be that guy, but just have conversations with people and, develop relationships from there. Look at it that way as another perspective.
Absolutely. And it opens the door to a lot of other opportunities as well, because now people don't see you based in this fixed role around your current job or your current title. Yeah. They see you as someone that's got a lot of different dimensions. It's like, oh, Nick, the IT director who also happens to be this social media Ronin janitor, right?
Yeah.
so then it's like
my alter ego.
No. Well, he's someone that we might want to tap into because we just happen to need someone as an advisor to us who's both technical, but also has this social media savvy, right? And all of a sudden you're off on a direction that, you may not even have been thinking about, making your next move in terms of your career. But suddenly it finds you because there are opportunities that are created just by you taking the time to extend this level of engagement into your network.
Yeah, and I agree with you. So when I started first creating content, I was really surprised the first time somebody asked me to be on their podcast. I was like, "What, really?" And he was just like, "Yeah, I've been listening to what you've been sharing over this time, and I just really want to hear your thoughts and bring you on the show. I think you'd be great for a guest." And you never know what opportunities are going to come up until you try, right?
Yeah.
So I always have this, this feeling that people harp too much on the negative impacts of something, right? Like, what if my boss sees it? What if my coworkers make fun of me? What if my family sees this? Okay, well, those are things that could happen, but then what's also the good things that can happen, right? If we're going to weigh the bad things, we got to equally weigh the good things too, right? Don't just sit there and only look at the bad things that can happen. So what if my coworkers see this? Okay, well, your coworkers see it. Maybe they're like, oh man, I didn't know he had those thoughts and ideas around this. Maybe, he or she could write an article for us for this magazine thing. There's totally other things that can come out of the woodworks when people get to know you.
It's true. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the actual mechanics of doing some of this. First, I want to reference that you put together what I thought was a really slick, but also really succinct manual to help teach people how to podcast. So tell us a little bit about the origins of that. Why did that suddenly become something where you thought, oh, I need to create this artifact?
Yeah. So the funny thing is that was before the pandemic, right? This was probably January of 2020. And, it's like New Year's resolutions and I'm cruising on LinkedIn and some guy's like, oh yeah, if you want to be a broadcaster, go out and buy the Shure SMB7 and get this audio interface. And for those who don't know anything about audio engineering, a Shure SMB7 is a broadcast microphone. If you've watched Joe Rogan's podcast or any super popular podcast on YouTube, you've seen that big black microphone. That's it. And that microphone's $400, right? And they tell you to get an audio interface that's another $400. So you're trying to they're telling you to drop $1,200, $1,300 on a podcast. When in my opinion, it's, just start with what you have. Because just like I told you, the promotion is going to be the hardest part. I would say if you're going to spend any money on anything in the beginning, and if you have money to spend, is hire people to promote it for you because that is the most difficult part. That will pay you back more than buying the equipment, buying the services that do everything. I would say the key to getting started in podcasting is just use what you have, right? You have a computer. You have earbuds that came with some phone you bought within the last 12 years. I know I used to have iPhones. I know I got like 8 pairs of those Apple iPod headphones that don't stay in my ears, but I have a bunch of them. And record on your computer, right? Or record over free Zoom, or use Anchor. Do whatever you can to do it for free until you're sure it's what you want to do.
Yeah, I love that. And, I think there are a couple of other parameters that are also, beneficial to consider when you're starting to figure out what it is that you want to undertake. one thing that you had done that I really appreciated was your 90-day video challenge, where you posted a video every day for 3 months. And they didn't, it wasn't like you went over the top with production, although your production clearly got more and more sophisticated as time went on, right? But there were a few principles that I noted, right from the outset, that, were influential to me as I started to embark on, similar type of thing. But I think they're also worth sharing, with others who might be considering this kind of thing, first of all. So, I think it would be helpful to kind of, state some of the basics that, and not assume that those things are so overtly obvious to everyone. But if you're shooting a video on a phone, right, it's best not to just hold the phone. You should have some kind of, there's all sorts of, devices that you can get to hold it and just
get
keep
a
it
stand
steady.
on Amazon for like 15 bucks. Yeah.
Exactly. So that the shaking, the natural shaking of your hand isn't distracting, for the actual video product that you then put out, right? So what are some of the other things that kind of jump to mind as sort of those obvious pointers from your perspective?
So if we're talking about video just in general as it pertains to social media, I would say, first thing is you use your phone, right? Because you already have a phone. You probably spend $1,000 on it because that's what phones cost now. It's got a good enough camera, right? Like you're not going to go shoot a whole production movie on it, but for a 90-second social media video, it's perfect. So I would start with that, and then caption your video, right? So use a captioning service, whether it's Otter.ai, Subtitle, Headliner.app, something like just Google captions. There's tons of them. Some of them are free, some of them are not. Some of them are free to a point. Depending on when you're listening to this all changes constantly. So just do a Google search, do auto caption videos. Adding captions is probably one of the best things you can do when it comes to a social media video, because on social media services, like I don't remember, it's like over 70% of people actually watch videos without the sound on. And then there's the other thought behind that too, is that deaf people can't consume your content if you don't have captions. So it's an inclusion and accessibility factor on top of it. I'm more thoughtful of it because I did sign language as my foreign language in college. I live in DC where Gallaudet is. I know sign language fairly well. I can maybe on like a fifth grader level. So it was always top of mind for me. But that's what I would say. And like you said, the stand, find somewhere to stand it. Decent lighting, doesn't have to be perfect, but make sure the light's in front of you, not on top of your head. Make sure you're in a quiet place. Just those are little tips, but don't go out and spend a ton of money at the very beginning because you might not even stick with it, right? Don't go buy $1,000 mirrorless camera because that's what a YouTuber recommended. It's one thing with YouTubers is realize that sometimes they're sponsored and they get paid money off of things you buy. So just start with what you have. And to sum it all up, right? Start with what you have, use your phone, caption your videos, get decent lighting, and be close enough to your phone that the sound is good in a quiet space so that the auto captioning can pick up the what you're saying and transcribe it so you don't have to do a bunch of manual work. That would be my few things for that.
Yeah, that's great. And, I love that in that little brochure that you put together, there are pointers in there where if you do want to make an investment, you could have an entire rig, including, a remote control to turn your video on and off and, have a secondary microphone source, all of that for under $25.
Yeah.
I would make one more point about the captioning. I'm married to someone who speaks English as a second language, and captions are always very helpful for someone who may not be able to ascertain exactly what the context of some of the things are. If you use jargon, if there's
because English is such a weird language. It is. Yeah.
So it's beneficial for people beyond just the hard of hearing, but Yeah, those are all great tips. And so can you tell listeners where they can find that reference manual that you put together?
Oh man, I'll have to put it on my website. um, I'll have to compile it because it's buried somewhere on LinkedIn and it's very difficult to find. So what I'll do is I'll put it in the show notes of this show.
Cool.
I'll put it on my website, nicklozano.com. I'll put it on there somewhere.
Okay, great.
Because right now it's not easy to find on LinkedIn, but.
And what's the title of that brochure that you put together? Do you recall?
It's the Solo Podcaster 2020 edition. So I probably should update it. Maybe it'd probably be better if I made it like a YouTube series. So that way you could pause and follow along and edit and pause. That just takes a bit more production. And a little more time on my side, but that's probably something I should do. The other thing I get asked all the time is how do I put music on my LinkedIn lives? I should probably make a video for that as well too, but all in good time.
Yeah, that was going to round out kind of the pointers that I thought were worth sharing. If you are going to add music, make sure that it doesn't step over your volume for whatever it is that you're saying. And also make sure that you grab something that either you have the licenses to or that's license free. I know that there's a lot of resources that you use on Spotify that provide some of those license free things. You can certainly Google it on YouTube. There's a lot of resources there as well. And most importantly, share a video that's, with your audience that's worth sharing, right? A lot of these things get liked, they get reposted. And what that means is starting with something that is a coherent idea, right? Begin with the end in mind. Make sure that you have a story to tell and you know how you're going to wrap up the ending.
And I would say it's practice, right? Don't expect to be, a master in the very beginning. Just like riding a bicycle, right? Nobody can just start pedaling right away and off to the races. You normally got to stumble a couple times before you're up on two wheels and running. So give it a fair bit amount of time and realize that, that you're not going to be perfect in the beginning. So I guess I'm saying give yourself a little bit of grace, right? It's not going to be a Hollywood production in the beginning, and just be fine with that.
Well, Nick, thanks for taking the time to talk with me through some of these concepts. And, it's a topic that I think is worth exploring. We'll probably find some additional guests that we can bring in so that we can continue to enlarge the perspective around some of these things. But I think where we're kind of landing right now is a great point to kind of wrap things up.
Yeah, I think it's great. And so wrapping up, I would say just start. Right? Find your medium that you like to do. Pick one platform. Don't try to be on all of them. If you try to be on all of them, it's going to be very difficult. And just start with one and go from there. Throw stuff to the wall and see what sticks.
That's great advice. Well, Nick Lozano, thank you for all that you shared today. You've got some great insights, and thank you for all that you've done on the production for our podcast here at Lead.exe.
Hey, you got it. And thanks everybody for listening. And if you hang around at the end of this, I'm going to put the very beginning of our conversation at the very end.
I love it. It'll be like the blooper roll, right?
Yeah, it'll be like the blooper reel. See if you're still listening. But yeah.
It's great. Well, thanks, Nick. Appreciate you taking the time today.
All right. Thanks, Brian.
Some of what I've been thinking about is just the variety of paths that we have now for really creating an online brand. Mm-hmm. I think people have thought about it for a long time in the context of LinkedIn. And, certainly I think that's still kind of, most roads for business professionals and businesses, leads to LinkedIn. And why not? I mean, it's a great platform for doing exactly that, right? For creating your brand, either as a professional, as an individual, or as a business entity. So I know that this is a topic that's been near and dear, to the two of us as we embarked on the journey of creating Lead.exe. But I've also thought about, how much time we've been doing this sort of thing now. and not just that, but seeing your own trajectory of how much involvement you've had developing a web presence, and really just going from Nick, the IT guy at the council, to being the Ronin janitor with your multiple various online involvements, your live stream, this podcast. I mean, all of the things that you've been doing. So I felt like who better than Nick Lozano as a qualified person for me to interview as a resource for other listeners for this podcast.
Yeah, so let's do it, man.
That was good. Kind of the genesis of the idea there.
Let's do it.
So, one book that I read, gosh, I guess this has been probably, it's 10 or 12 years, was Eric Qualman's Digital Leader. And I had the good fortune of, hearing Eric Qualman speak at a really small industry event that I was at in Aspen, Colorado. And when I say small, I mean, there were probably only 20 people, in this room with him up front talking. And he had just published this book, Digital Leader. And, everyone who attended got a copy of it. And, I ended up chatting with the guy. I mean, he hung out for a couple of days with us as we were doing all sorts of crazy activities that went along with the, the event for this now defunct company. But, it was really interesting talking with him about it because, having come up through internet radio and all of the things that I had been involved in the 1990s, that later sort of got attributed to, this millennial generation. It's like, oh, well, the millennials know everything about, .coms. And it was like, man, I came from a generation where we were creating all that stuff. There was no reference point for any of it. And, then to read that book and to see how he had framed the context around being a digital leader, so much of it resonated with me at that time. And as I was kind of preparing, talking with you today, I was flipping back through some of these things and I was like, this is amazing. I mean, at the pace of how quickly technology moves, this book that was written a decade or so ago is still as relevant right now as it was, the day it came out.
Yeah,
in fact,
that's
perhaps
because leadership
even more
doesn't
so.
change, man. It's always the same. It's never changed.
Well,
that's like how you can read The Art of War, and it's literally full of great leadership lessons, and the thing's thousands of years old.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm thinking more in context of even how do you harness that leadership in the digital context, right? How do you leverage things like LinkedIn? How do you create an online persona? How do you develop brand identity for yourself or your organization? So those are the things that, to me, it was sort of remarkable going through this and recognizing how fresh so much of it still is. And as I reflected on it, I thought about part of that, it has to be related to the pace of adoption, right? And if you consider that Gen X was already living and breathing in the 1990s, what by the first decade of the 2000s it became attributed to millennials, it was really that amount of time that it took for that adoption to take place, where it just became more and more systematic. And then you had the advent of other technologies along the way, like the smartphone, that I think just sort of supercharged what that adoption looked like, towards the end of the first decade of this century. Similarly, I think we've gone through a lot of this, as in the last decade, we've made this pivot, from, into Web 2.0 territory, right? A lot of this utilization of social media. And now we've really seen that kind of come to manifest with, in the professional realm. And then I think sort of the supercharging effect, like we saw with the smartphone, has come in this past year of pandemic. Now I got a bunch of people locked indoors, with additional time on their hands, at least from their typical commute, for most people. And so there's been sort of a proliferation in a way of a lot of this online identity development. So, I'm just kind of putting that out there as, positing my own theory about it. But I mean, do you share that perception, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on a lot of great points. I think there's different layers to it, right? It's not necessarily a generational thing as much as it is personality trait, I would say, right? It's easier for someone who's an extrovert to hop online and not worry about what they're saying or what they're doing, because they already are very outgoing, right? And I've noticed that just along the time that I've been pretty active.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that, because I know you yourself, as you started your own video campaign, you talked with me personally about how uncomfortable that was for you, that was not
Yeah.
a natural sort of transition for you.
Do we want to roll this in and start? I mean, we are recording right now, but
Yeah. I mean, aren't we doing the thing? Oh, sorry. I guess I should have started off with the. Yes. So maybe you can cut and paste some of that in lieu of a typical intro that we would do.
now we'll just leave this in. Just roll the intro. It'll make a great YouTube cut. Here we go.
Awesome.